You're listening to Muslimish Freethinkers, a podcast dedicated to fostering conversations on matters of faith and disbelief.
Let me switch the cameras and welcome everyone to another Muslimish broadcast. Muslimish is a nonprofit organization. Its mission statement is to create a safe and supportive and open-minded environment for the exchange of thoughts and ideas among current and former Muslims, to foster a pluralistic society that respects the rights of all individuals to live according to their conscience, and to abolish blasphemy and apostasy laws across the globe. With me in the studio is Rabbi Jeffrey Falick. Welcome.
Falick. I'll just correct you on that one thing.
Falick, sorry. I had the pleasure of knowing Jeff for a few years now. Rabbi Jeffrey Falick serves as a rabbi at the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit and Farmington Hills, Michigan. His education includes ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Jeff has held leadership positions in the Society for Humanistic Judaism and the Association of Humanistic Rabbis. As a Jewish educator, he has served as a faculty member in numerous programs, including the Melton School and many congregational and community-wide offerings. In his community work, Jeff serves on the executive committee of Freedom House Detroit and the advisory committee of the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights. In 2018, he was recognized as Freethinker of the Year by the Center for Inquiry of Michigan for his work in humanistic community building. Thank you, Jeff, for being with us in this broadcast.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of Muslimish, and it's a privilege.
It is one of the very interesting organizations that I have known late in my life. And when I discovered what is it about, it was a surprise to me. I was not expecting to find such an organization that can take the meaning of identity, religion, culture, and faith and mix them together in a different order, giving a new interpretation for a person's connection to a certain religion or a group of thoughts. And it is very interesting to us as Muslims or ex-Muslims or cultural Muslims, any person with a Muslim background, because Judaism and Islam are very close religions, although we don't have a humanistic Islamic organization or a phenomena. So it is a new concept for us, and that's why it is very interesting for us. So let's start with talking about humanism. Just for those who do not know the meaning of the term humanism, what is a humanism?
Well, I like the definition of the American Humanist Association, which uses the fewest words possible, good without a God. But of course, it goes much further than that. It's really the approach to life that seeks to be a moral and good person, it seeks to guide us to be good and moral persons without supernatural or independent of supernatural authority. And it manifests itself in a number of ways, sometimes ceremonial, as we do it. Sometimes it's more of a secular format. But by and large, it's sort of what I think some of my friends used to call atheism plus. Although not every humanist uses that title of atheist. I do. I'm an atheist and an agnostic. But it's really the value system. It's really the ability to explore through reason what is right and what is wrong, and to do it for the betterment of humankind.
So a humanist usually does not believe in the existence of a supreme deity. So when the humanistic Judaism was formed, the term seems to be an oxymoron. How did humanistic Judaism form, and what does it mean?
Well, it's important to understand that there's a long history going back, at least in the latter part of Jewish history, going back to the 18th century, really, of Reformation movements within Judaism. In that, we were really drawing upon the sort of similar cultural environment that the Protestant Reformation drew upon, although with a very different kind of approach. The Enlightenment and all the thinking that happened around that time, along with things that were very unique to the Jews, including their hope to be emancipated in what was quickly in the late 18th and into the 19th century, becoming a slightly more, depending on where you were, secular Europe. Those all had an effect on creating different formats of being a Jew, including some that were wholly, completely secular, although that didn't really emerge as a major movement until later in the 19th century. Already in the mid-19th century, we have all kinds of reformed attitudes and movements addressing ritual, addressing the role of the scripture, the authorship of the scripture, the validity and authority of the Talmud and of the rabbis from that period, and on and on and on. And what emerged from that was what continues to be the largest non-Orthodox Jewish movement today, the Reform movement. The Reform movement had a conservative branch, which we today call conservative Judaism, which is a liberal branch of Judaism with possibly the worst possible name ever assigned to a religious movement of more or less liberal Jews. I love it when I'm with my queer conservative rabbi friends, and they have to introduce themselves as conservative rabbis, and you just want to giggle because there's about as much conservative about them as there is about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Anyway, this is the rich body of questioning and philosophy that set the stage in the mid-20th century for other innovations. The first real attempt at a humanistic Judaism was actually by Mordechai Kaplan, who was a professor and thinker at the Conservative Seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And he started a sort of what we maybe would call religious humanist version of Judaism, that today called Reconstructionist Judaism. It's larger than us, but not terribly large in and of itself. But it did not do away with the metaphor of God. It was a little bit more, if I'm remembering correctly, a little bit more John Dewey-ish, I'm forgetting, Durkheim-ish, using God as a symbol and so forth. Sherwin comes along in the 1960s, a graduate and ordinee of the Hebrew Union College, the same place I went, and a Reform rabbi, at a time when many Reform rabbis sort of had a more metaphorical understanding of God. And right here in Detroit, his hometown, he decides to experiment with a small congregation in the suburbs, Birmingham, Michigan. That's where we had our original name. We just changed it this week. The Birmingham Temple is no more, at least in name. And he proposed a radical kind of way of being Jewish, even more so than any of the previous Reform rabbis had ever thought of, which was to say, we're just going to write that whole deity out of the program. And there's all kinds of ways that one can understand what his ism was. He used to call himself an agnostic, meaning that the whole idea of God is predicated on our ability to talk about it. And since no one's ever talking about the same thing, when they talk about a God, it becomes sort of an irrational and irrelevant discussion. But he was a functional atheist, as I am. And he set about convincing these folks, a post-Holocaust generation, if you will, maybe a second generation, that there was a way that they could be part of the Jewish and, yes, religious community, because it is a synagogue, without necessarily having to believe things about God or even having to say things about God that they didn't believe. There's a lot of Jews who believe what we do, but they still say the old words. His radical his radical innovation was that not only would we have our beliefs, but we would say what we mean and mean what we say. So he rewrote the liturgy probably more radically than anyone ever had. And he set forth on this journey that didn't have a name yet, and ultimately landed on Humanistic Judaism, and later in some quarters secular Humanistic Judaism, to differentiate it from some of the more, I suppose, God-centered, even if God is a metaphor, versions of being Jewish. So that's really, in a nutshell, what he did in the early 1960s. And he did build a movement. We have congregations coast to coast here in North America. And we also have groups and so forth abroad. There's a large, half the Jews in the world living in Israel. There's a large contingency there that are organized in their own way. And we continue to be, in many ways, very radical on the Jewish scene. In other ways, we actually mirror what more and more Jews have been saying and doing for the last 60 some odd years. So that's our history in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jeff. A question is: did Rabbi Sherwin Wine, was he a rabbi before he became an atheist? Did he had that transformation after he was an ordained rabbi?
So the story, as I understand it, is that he really was never a theist in the sense that he was a supernatural theist. And I should say that's true about today, even about a good number of Reform rabbis, probably fewer conservative rabbis, certainly some Reconstructionist rabbis. They're not, they don't really believe that there's a God out there in the beyond and so forth. But he participated in a movement that spoke that way, that thought that way. And I'll tell you that my understanding is he was a committed humanist in his heart. There were a lot of humanists, by the way, in those days who, quote unquote, worshipped and used God language. Mordecai Kaplan's Reconstructionist Judaism wasn't the only one of them. The Unitarian Universalist Association to this day has an enormous humanistic segment, and some of them do attend churches or fellowships there where they also use God language. I think what Sherwin wanted to do, though, was to become more honest about our beliefs. And because he was very charismatic and also very brilliant, and had a stronghold here, or at least a base of support here in Detroit, this being his hometown and very connected, he was able to take this risk. I don't think in rabbinical school they knew per se, but I can tell you that he was not alone, and that honesty being what it is in the liberal Jewish world, most liberal, be they conservative, Reform, or Reconstructionist rabbis, in other words, non-Orthodox rabbis, that's what we mean by liberal, they're pretty honest that they don't necessarily believe in a God that guides the universe or intervenes or interferes in human affairs. Many of them do feel that God is real and that God has an important pull on them emotionally or morally or spiritually or whatever the heck it is. I don't find it compelling because I never know what the hell they're talking about, I'll be honest with you. Theology to me is a made-up thing, and most of them are just engaging in things they made up anyway. So that was a question about Sherwin, but it really extends to Rabbi to this day.
Right, and I will have some personal questions to you too, but
okay.
It's difficult for me to understand exactly what you're talking about as far as being, like entering into the studies, the Jewish studies, while not being exactly a theist, because in the Islamic universities or the seminary studies of Islam, it's almost impossible to have that. They're very much faith-based. I would understand if they were more academic, like a person doing an Islamic studies degree in a university. That is possible, that that has nothing to do with his personal faith. But for the traditional Islamic schools, madrasas, or Al-Azhar, or the Hawza, we call them Hawza in the Shia Islamic thought, it would be very I don't have an example in history that is known to us that a person would enter into the studies without having faith. We have people who have finished their studies and then they had a change in their faith. So that's something that is interesting. Is your story, Jeff, similar to
Well,
Sherwin's story?
Yes and no. There's, first of all, let me just address what you were saying. It's, I understand that it's hard to grasp that. Jews from the East tend to have a similar difficulty understanding that. There was this cauldron of Europe, particularly Western Europe, Central and Western Europe, that produced all these different kinds of approaches to God in Christianity. And it leaked over into the Jewish world and created an enormous amount of questioning. So Sherwin was by no means the first. He was actually well within a line of a lot of Jews. And some of these reformers really did believe in God. Some of these reformers believed God was more of a metaphor or an idea that influenced people to the good. But anybody entering any of these seminaries today, outside of the Orthodox Jewish world, which is still quite large and growing, and has its own wings of modern ones and ultra-Orthodox ones, anybody entering that is basically free to walk their own journey. And I've had many rabbis who did not really believe in that much supernatural stuff, if anything at all. Some of them believed that there was sort of a moral mandate, that there had to be a unifying moral impetus to the universe, and they call that God. Even those people, and this is really universal in the non-Orthodox world, even those people accept the human hand in all of Scripture, certainly in all of the rabbinical interpretations. And by the way, there's some modern Orthodox, it's a minority, but there's some modern Orthodox Jews who believe the same thing, that these are human authored texts and they reflect the understandings, or maybe the best understandings that people had back then about their deity and or deities, because we happen to know that ancient Israelites and Judeans were not necessarily monotheists either, but that's a different talk for a different time. I'd be happy to come back and talk and discuss that. When I got into rabbinical school, that was the atmosphere I got in. Now, understand too, I went in the 80s, and there were other problems back then. We had not yet come to terms with homosexuality, and I'm gay. At the time I was married, that was pretty common. A lot of gay men got married. My ex-wife, she knew things. This was not a sealed up Cold War style secret in our relationship. But it was something I was grappling with. And so I ping-ponged, and like many rabbis who were dealing, particularly in that era, rabbis and all kinds of clergy and others too, I ping-ponged around, traditional faith and this and that. I never had a strong belief that there was truly something supernatural. If anything, I was just trying to do my best to connect to the chain of tradition of humans. So even at my most traditional, and I got pretty traditional for a number of years. At the time of my divorce, I had already begun to let go of some of that because I couldn't put my mind around life after death. And in fact, Judaism never developed a very good theory of that. They sort of have a world to come idea. At the very end of times, we'll all pop up on earth again and be resurrected. But it's not very well developed as to exactly what that will look like. And in terms of what happens after you die, it's always been murky. My own Reform rabbi told me that we don't really know what happens. We presume nothing, but your afterlife will be in your children's memory and the memory of the people for whom you do good. And I liked that. So that was the Jewish world I always lived in, no matter how ritually traditional I was. And I'll tell you, I've met plenty of Orthodox Jews. They're certainly not the majority, but plenty of Orthodox Jews who believe the same thing too. Judaism as a religion has always been very behaviorally based. So if you did stuff right, there wasn't likely to be an inquisition about your beliefs. And I sort of walked that line. I was for a time a conservative rabbi when they were much more to the right. They had a bloody battle over gay rights. The reform movement just sort of in a hangdog way in the 1990s said, yeah, we're really sorry about all that anti-gay stuff. We're done with it now. Let's just pretend it didn't happen. Yay, gay people. June's our month. Whereas the conservative movement struggles with it, I would say, until recent times. They actually had a big break off of seminaries and things. So nobody really tested me on beliefs. And it wasn't really part of our discussions. And in fact, I remember that there were rabbis who did have strong beliefs in God, again, from a liberal point of view. And they used to say, we don't talk about God enough as Jews. And I used to think to myself, yeah, that's probably for the best. And that was at a time when I was trying.
Mhm.
I think it was always a metaphor, but at least I was giving it a shot,
Yes.
But in the end, I realized, certainly after coming out, getting divorced, and moving on with my life, I realized that I'm an atheist, and I just have to deal with it and see what possibilities there are for me. Fortunately, I was not working in a synagogue when that revelation happened, so I didn't really have to change anything in my lifestyle.
Very similar to Reverend Sherwin Wine, or Rabbi Sherwin Wine, a life of courage. I can also describe your journey as a life of courage, Jeff. It's it's a combination of struggles that a person had to face, and be true to oneself to come out of.
It's a good place to be. Authenticity. It lets you be much more honest.
Definitely.
I don't worry about anything coming out about my past. Everybody knows everything about me.
Right. Yeah, authenticity is such a manifestation, one of the greatest manifestations of freedom that a person can reach. Jeff, also a few questions. So Sherwin Wine, when he started this movement, was he thinking that it will be inclusive within conservative synagogues, within the same congregation, or he always thought of separating?
No, he founded this to be its own movement, and in fact, there is a story, not from the conservative world. Their grapplings were with Mordecai Kaplan and what he was doing, but there's a very famous story of a kind of a little mini schism in our own movement that occurred in the 1980s, 90s. The Reform movement at that time, and really for much of its early history, was sort of was much more rationalist, and particularly with regard to its approach to ritual and so forth. Yes, extremely theistic in its language, but also a little bit more rational when it came to observances and that kind of thing, and about freedom to a great extent. This continued, and actually the Reform movement went to war against itself in the 1970s. They actually produced a prayer book. Used to be, it was the Gates of Prayer. I think it was 2 prayer books ago now, that had, I think, 15 alternative services for the Sabbath, for Friday night, including one that didn't have any mention of God, at least in the English. In the Hebrew, it did, but the translations were creative and left God out. This led some people in our movement, notably one of our congregations in Cincinnati, which is where one of the branches, the seminary is, to believe that the time was ripe for them to affiliate with the Reform movement, to leave us behind for all kinds of reasons, and to affiliate with the Reform movement. And so in the 1980s, they started to make a strong effort. But this coincided with the return of Reform Judaism to Jewish tradition. Not necessarily, it was a right-wing turn in the sense of ritual and observance. They were meanwhile quite a bit to the left on issues of gay rights and women's rights and all the other kinds of inclusiveness. So this congregation, Beth Adam, the House of Humanity, if you will, they petitioned, and their rabbi was also from the seminary there in Cincinnati. They petitioned for membership in what was then called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, today the Union for Reform Judaism. And it really, all of the encouragement that they got from the faculty of the seminary, from people in the movement, it looked like they were a shoo-in. And finally, after years of debate and how do we get this on the agenda and so forth, they finally brought it before whatever the governing commission was at that time of the Union for, as we now call it, Reform Judaism. And they voted on the membership application of Beth Adam to the Union of Reform Judaism, and they were rejected more soundly than you could ever imagine. They basically said to them, "We don't care if you don't believe in God. you still have to say the prayers. We don't care if you change them a little bit, but you're not taking it, you're not going to go to this extreme where you expunge God from it. That's not who we are as a Reform movement. And indeed, they uniquely continue to pray in an increasingly traditional language, I must say, with the exception of the inclusivity of women and gays and so forth, which is not so traditional. But they continue to do that. And their new prayer book solution is to have little meditations on the page, on the facing page. Oh, God, I don't believe in you, but I believe in humanity, and therefore I feel a connection to my people, stuff like that. Stuff that we'd say out loud, but they just have it in, sort of pica italics on the bottom of the page. So you're welcome. And many of their rabbis will tell me, well, I have lots of atheist members. And I say to them, well, but can they be openly in your service atheist? And they just sort of, snicker at me. Mm-hmm. There was no inclusivity. When, by the way, when the decision was made, Sherwin, I don't know if this was real or not, but it's said that he popped a bottle of champagne open. He was very happy that Beth Adam was rejected from the Reform movement. They never came back to us, though. They're independent.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, and in the timeline of the Judaistic Reform movement, I mean the Reform not with the capital R, with the small r, the general
Reformation,
Reform, Reformation within religion. There was a point where questioning God was not tolerated. Is that true?
Yeah, look.
How far is that point?
It's really it was in the well, everybody was questioning a theistic God in the Enlightenment in the late 1700s, but the Jews anyway didn't get on this bus until Napoleon came to town, because Napoleon was bringing all these French ideas with him, regardless of his, leave aside his autocratic nature. He had that. And then the Jews were forced to think about some of this more and more, particularly as they wanted to be liberated and to become full member citizens, which had always been denied them in places like the Holy Roman Empire, all those various Germanic principalities and duchies. And there was at that time also, coterminous with this, there was new ways of thinking about God that were emerging in the Christian world. Kantian philosophy was very popular among a lot of the early Reform rabbis. And so there was a questioning. God has always been sort of, in many ways in Judaism, since the medieval times forward, and maybe even earlier, God has sort of always been understood as something that we can know about only in what we don't know about God. Maimonides spoke about this. The only way to describe God is the via negativa, what can't be said about God. And in the end, it's so much mouth games and word games, but it did open the door for a lot of Jews, particularly from the mid-19th century going forward, to question things. Whole branches of Jews broke away. Lots of Jews became secular Jews in the United States. There was a strong movement of secular Jews on the Lower East Side and in some of the other newcomer communities, some of them socialist, some of them communist. That wasn't so popular with the Americans that were taking them in, and it caused us problems later. In Europe, Eastern Europe, where they did not have this reform, this religious reform. The religious Jews there retained their orthodoxy, but other Jews began to think of themselves in terms of a people, a nation. Nationalism was on the rise, and we have many distinctions that are nationalist. Now, yes, Zionism grew out of that, but it wasn't the only nationalist movement. There was in some ways, a larger, more popular one called the Bund, which was an attempt in the Bund being Yiddish, was an attempt in Eastern Europe to try to achieve a national independence or recognition for the Jewish people, as they wanted to be called. And these folks tended to be not just secular, but frequently atheist. Only the Zionist movement, because that's the one that survived, of course, sort of became so popular that it sucked up everybody, including Orthodox Jews. Still hasn't sucked up all the ultra-Orthodox Jews yet, but it will. So I understand how in Islam, God is so incredibly central. And in Judaism, particularly modern Orthodox and Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, you hear a lot of that too. But you also hear skepticism and doubt, sotto voce sometimes. You're not going to hear it from the pulpit as much, but there's always been this ability of Jews to argue these things through and to, as it were, become heretics. You know, that we really reclaimed our number one heretic of all time, of all modern times, I guess, Benedict Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, in 17th century Amsterdam. He became a hero of academic Judaism. He became a hero of our movement. We named our Sunday school after him. And you will see Reform rabbis acknowledging him with respect today, as well as conservative and Reconstruction, all the liberal rabbis. God just was. And the fact that we didn't understand him didn't matter. We didn't really have to talk about him a lot. Serving him meant doing the things that were the commandments that you were supposed to do anyway. And those things were the mores of our societies, wherever we were located. So, and honestly, a lot of the things that make being an observant Jew today difficult are associated with modernity. My great-great-grandparents didn't have to worry too much about turning on a light switch on the Sabbath, because they didn't have any light switches. There was just, they didn't have to worry about where they were driving because nobody had a car. There were a lot of things that grew out of that. And I also don't think they really thought about God that much in that sense. I don't think there was a theological struggle for them. God was, and so were the Jews, and God and the Jews were suffering together against anti-Semitism. To the extent that God probably meant something, it was comfort to them.
Right. So if Reformation and the growth of the Reform movement was a prerequisite for such an organization or a movement as the Humanistic Judaism to flourish and to be born from, then Islam is still at the first steps of reform. I feel they haven't even entered it with strength yet. I can safely, though, say that we are right now entertaining reformation, because there is a lot of reform movements that are no longer suppressed, and that they have a very popular voice, especially after the failure of political traditional Islam. Manifested in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and in some other parties in other countries. So I feel this is the Islam right now is working with reform. And do you feel that is necessary before a humanistic model of religion to come out? Especially that there are similarities between Islam and Judaism.
There are a lot. First of all, a lot of the similarities are, simply because one religion was related to the other and how it formed. Keep in mind, though, that Judaism spread in a very different way and in very different contexts to a lot of places. Judaism was essentially a powerless, the religion of a powerless and small group of people. And much of what they were seeking, particularly in Europe, was belonging. And they wanted to both save their religion, but they also wanted to belong to the wider society. So many of the reforms that they made were simply about trying to be more like everyone else. They thought this would help keep Jews who were converting out. They weren't converting sincerely to Catholicism or Protestantism, but they were converting as they wanted out, and there was no secular option. And at the same time, they also had their philosophical reasons to make it more flexible and more modern in their context. So it was really a creature of the Central European Jewish and Western European Jewish experience. Interestingly, it affected very few Jews because most of the Jews didn't live there. It didn't actually flourish until it came here to the United States. When all those Jews came here from Eastern Europe, they met a tiny, smallish group of German Jews and Bohemian Jews and so forth who greeted them here and welcomed them in, and sometimes welcomed them in a little grudgingly to their now the clubs that they had set up in the 1850s and 60s. So all of this is to say that there are always unique historical circumstances about any reformation, any group, any change. And the thing that has characterized the Jews until recently has been powerlessness and the desire to become as much as possible a part of the larger community around us, along with all the wonderful religious things and theologies and philosophies and so forth. That's essentially what's the driving force of bringing people to synagogues. One of the reasons we're losing members now is because we have different driving forces about how Jews express their Jewish identity. Islam in the West is grappling with a lot of things. I think Islam has, though there are many places where Islam has been a persecuted minority. This only recently have you had the joy and privilege of learning what that means in a place like Germany or what have you, or in the United States. And so in that sense, you've sort of joined the Jewish experience, if you will. I think that the unique pressures that are here today, which are different, we have different ideas about sexuality, about racial minorities, about all those kinds of things than the Jews who came here in the 1860s to the 1880s and 1920s. But those pressures are going to exert themselves on Islam, and Islam is going to have a different basket of truths that they're probably going to have to make decisions about. Islam in the West, which I'm sure will affect Islam in the East. Just like the Jewish community of the West has affected the Jewish communities of the East. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think that while we're certainly an interesting historical example to modern Muslims who are questioning or who are desirous of holding on to Islam in one form or another, we may be a limiting example, because the Jewish experience is very much based on the times in which it took place. And we can't recreate those factors the same way. In some ways, you have much more freedom today to do what you want to do. There were restrictions on what Jews could do. In many places, the government wouldn't approve of a Reform temple because the Orthodox had a lot of power and the government still had its hands in that. In the United States, that wasn't true, but it was true throughout Europe. Here, you're going to have other issues.
Jeff, at this point, I'd like to ask usually the guests to feel free to have a sip of water, or
I've got mine.
It's midway through, and I want to also let our audience know that if you'd like to get hold of Rabbi Jeff, here's his email. Let me take off this.
Can we put that there?
Oh, you don't want it there?
No, it's fine. It's fine. That is actually not my current email, although you can still get me at that. It's actually rabbi@ch-detroit.org.
I'll tell you what. Yeah, I will basically. Let me get back here.
We're going to keep that one active for a while, but yeah.
Yeah, and this is the new site, right?
This is the website now has three names: abrahamtemple.com.org and the new one.
Look forward to this. Yes, so this is the new address if you'd like to get hold for
there you go.
More information. I have a few more questions, and I hope that we will have enough time to just go over them. Jeff, thank you for your patience with us again and for being with us on this show. So the one of the actually, before I talk about this, I wanted to ask is how was the reaction of the Jewish community to the formation of the Humanistic Judaism? I know that Rabbi Sherwin was called the atheist rabbi.
And that was Time magazine. Yeah.
And there has always been atheist Jews, like ex-Jews that have left the religion.
Or just Jews, yeah.
Right. But to actually create that branch might be intimidating for some groups. So how was the reaction of
So as you say, there were always atheist Jews. It was very, very popular. He was well known, whole scads of them everywhere. And they rarely called themselves ex-Jews because the Judaism and your Jewish identity wasn't necessarily based solely on your beliefs. Like, as I said, most people didn't talk about their beliefs a great deal. If you did the right thing and you fit in, you were fine. And fitting in meant different things at different times. What there had never been before was an atheist synagogue and an atheist rabbi. And believe me, no matter what he wanted to call humanistic, this, that, everybody knew he was an atheist. And Time magazine made sure of that with that article in 1964. And they did not like it. They did not like it. They could have had 12 atheist Jews working in the Jewish Welfare Board's office, including the executive director. I'm making this up, of course, and no one would have cared. And they could have openly talked about it. But a rabbi with a synagogue, with services, with a Sunday school, with these rich, are you kidding me? And no, they called him to account. He held his own. And he ultimately forged ahead. Today, I think that the people in the conservative and reform and reconstructionist world would be very surprised that such a thing happened, because they are and tend to be very, very open-minded and welcoming. Look, they'll tease me from time to time, and they know that we have profound disagreements, and they're not all about God. Most of them have to do with a lot of other kinds of things, which are related to free thought and whatever it is, Israel, or the boundaries and parameters of our community and what organizations and synagogues should be or shouldn't be. But they no longer ostracize us as anyway. We're as much a part of the synagogue scene here in Detroit as any other synagogue is. Where the dividing line, of course, exists is between the Orthodox and everybody else. And there is a little bit of a couple little very, very modern Orthodox, that sort of dance on both sides of the boundary and are definitely Orthodox. But by and large, it's on the liberal side, we're completely accepted. But that was not the case in 1963, and it was a scandal for many Jews that there would be a synagogue like that. They didn't like what it communicated to Christians. There were no Muslims, that they worried about at that time here, but they didn't like what it communicated to them. If you could have a synagogue that was atheistic, what did that mean about the rest of the Jews? I think they soon realized, as most Jews eventually do, that when they're not basically hating on Jews anyway, in the historical anti-Semitism, they don't really give a lot of thought to what we do. So I think that became less of a concern too.
So in Orthodox Islam, when someone pronounces that they do not believe in God or even have doubt about the existence of God, they usually are pronounced as a non-Muslim. There's some harsher terms like infidel, and there are very harsh designations by Islamic law, jurisprudence that follows up to that. Is there something similar to that in Judaism or Orthodox Judaism?
No, actually, Orthodox, you can't leave. Once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew. There are responsa going back. This is partly a historical outcome of the persecution of the Jews, the forced conversions and so forth. There were many times when Jews, and sometimes even believed sincerely, even though there was a knife or a sword over their heads, that they were converting, and later chose to return to the Jewish community. And the rabbis had a problem, and particularly in the 15th century going forward, there was a big problem about what do you do with such people. And the halacha, the Jewish law, was established that once you are a Jew, you are always a Jew. You might be a Jew who sins, but as the halacha says, a Jew who sins is nevertheless a Jew. So in fact, you can't get out. It's impossible. If you have a Jewish mother, or if you were a convert, they may deem your conversion to have been insincere, but that's not usually the case. Now, the bigger punishment would come from God, but that's between you and God. God might, quote unquote, cut you off from the world to come. And if you ask an ultra-Orthodox rabbi what that means. They'll all have different answers. But more to the point is, in ultra-Orthodoxy in particular, but in all Orthodox Judaism, we're talking about very close-knit communities, very thick bands of networking and of connections, and you can simply be shunned. There is a formal process of excommunication. Doesn't make you a non-Jew. It makes you a Jew who doesn't get to be part of the community anymore. But that's not really something that's practiced on a regular basis. Most of the ultra-Orthodox Jews who walk away simply have to leave their entire existence behind. And I think anybody who's watched the Netflix miniseries Unorthodox knows how that works. I don't like reality TV, so I haven't seen one, My Unorthodox Life, that they're showing, and I've heard mixed things about it. But my understanding is they show a little bit more about what goes on in the modern Orthodox world. There, it's more complicated. The modern Orthodox world, most modern Orthodox Jews tend to have family members who are not Orthodox. I do. I have Orthodox family members that I am extremely close with. And I have plenty of family members that are secular Jews, that are not involved, that are Reform Jews, and you name it. So when you start talking about the modern Orthodox Judaism, sort of Jewish community going leftward, but even there in the modern Orthodox Jewish community, if you leave, it can cause problems between children and their parents. But we have problems the other way too. One of the phenomena in liberal Judaism is that we have kids that are going over to more and more Orthodoxy, and it's caused rifts in their families. Some of their rabbis on that side who are bringing them in, who are in a sense proselytizing them, they're Jews, but proselytizing them into traditional Judaism, are more sensitive to it than others. I usually hear, well, you have to compromise because you honor your mother and father is so important. Even if they're sinning, you still have to love them. That's not for you to decide. That's for God. And then I've heard others that said, no, you have to leave them behind. I'm happy to say it's the former more than the latter. So we don't really, because we're not a faith community per se, but a community of, you name it, of a peoplehood. That's the best I can give you, because national means one thing, whatever. You can't leave if the religion won't let you leave, and if you leave, you're leaving without any consequences to the religion on the liberal side.
Right, and I have a couple of questions about the Judaism being more of people rather than a religion. Probably at the end of the episode,
Sure.
Interesting enough, Rabbi, that the Muslimish chapter in New York, for example, they hold a lot of activities with the ex-Hasidic community. Over there, they find a lot of commonality between them. I think in that sense, the Hasidic community is closer to the...
yes, for sure.
The experience of leaving the Hasidic community, or leaving the faith, actually,
tragic, really.
Within a Hasidic community, it's similar to, in some cases, questioning faith within a Muslim society. Moving forward to today, what are some challenges that are facing humanistic Judaism? Before that, I wanted to ask you a question that I've read this book that I've obtained as a gift from the Society of Humanistic Judaism, and I haven't found that. Maybe I'd like to ask you: was Rabbi Sherwin ever? From what you've said, I feel that the answer is no. But I want to ask you anyway: was his life ever in danger? Did he ever feel not safe? Was the opposition?
I don't know everything. I'm sure he got his death threat like everybody else does, but it was a different time too, because somebody would have to stop and write a letter to do that. I don't believe so.
No. So there isn't this type of environment within the questioning Jewish community.
And he was coming out of liberal Judaism, so they were pissed off mostly because they felt threatened by him.
Not far off. Okay. So the question is, what are some of the challenges that are facing humanistic Judaism? It has evolved since its founding.
It has.
How has it evolved? And I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it alive. We're probably the first organization to use your new name, and that's part of the evolution. How has it evolved, and what are some of the challenges that it's facing?
Well, we are still on the radical end of things, even though the other movements have moved closer to us in some ways. They've moved closer to us on intermarriage, particularly the Reform movement. They used to be much more condemnatory. Now they're much more welcoming. And I think eventually they may come to our point of view that it's actually a beautiful thing to bring people into our community. But the challenges we're facing are the challenges that every synagogue and church in this country is facing, and I assume mosques as well, although I know that's a different level of commitment. How people express their identity is no longer through this rich belonging, this rich sense of belonging to a place like a synagogue. And it's very, very, very challenging for us. Our demographics in our movement overall are aging. But that's not just us. That's in the Reform movement. It's in the conservative. The conservative movement is in terrible condition because they also have a ban on their rabbis conducting intermarriage, which right away creates this non-welcoming thing. I would say that's probably the number one issue. What we have going for us is that we look a lot more like and speak and talk a lot more like the other Jews in this country, particularly the young ones. We believe that you can be Jewish, that you can have multiple identities, that, you're Jew, what you are and who you are as a Jew is up to you. And in that sense, while we have a kind of a narrow theology or philosophy, if you're referring to God, we have the most expansive understanding of what it is to be a Jew. Anybody can come in, anybody can join. There's no, you don't have to have your ticket stamped. You don't have to go through the ritual or the study or the circumcision or all that kind of thing. So we're hoping that will be something that will help us in the future. But yes, I am very concerned. It keeps me up at night, worrying about the future of our movement. And good that it should, because it makes me, I think, more responsive and better rabbi and better leader for my community. But it can also be quite exhausting having to fight all of the tides of society for the things that you believe in. And that's just going with history.
Right, and it's not really particular to your movement.
Not at all. I wish it was unique. Maybe we could address it better.
I was in a discussion yesterday with a group of friends, and they were talking about kind of the decline of a national identity and the rise of other types of identities that people identify more with. And it creates challenges for everyone, from businesses all the way to humanistic movements, religions, congregations, etc.
It's been going on for a while. I will tell you that I've been in this business for a while, and we started talking about this in the late 90s. There was that famous book by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, where he examined belonging in the United States. And we may be after the pandemic seeing a little bit of a left turn back. Who knows how people will feel about it? Maybe they'll be searching for more in person. We'll see.
On that note, so what are your aspirations moving forward?
Well, we've taken concrete steps at our congregation to try to ensure a future, to build our community. Interestingly, we don't tend to lose people once they're in. We lose them because they grow old, is what happens, and that's life. But we've divorced ourselves from that old way that Jews paid for their synagogues into a voluntary pledge support, so we don't have these mandatory dues anymore. We've become very generous as a community about providing education for children. And so we're trying to keep our school going, and our B'nai Mitzvah, the bar and bat mitzvah program for 13-year-olds. But we've also tried very hard, and this we did not without any, we did this without any ulterior motives. We have tried to put our values much more strongly into play in the community. Sherwin did that, but he was doing it in a different time and world. He, for instance, fought very hard against the moral majority of its time, the 80s and so forth, bringing us that new kind of Reagan conservatism that look what it's become. And we're out there with a strong social justice message as well. So we adopted a Syrian family and took care of them. Unfortunately, they were not able to settle here because Dad was deported, but I can report they were all united as a family just a few weeks ago in the Netherlands, That was actually one of the most beautiful things. Yeah. This was a lovely family, a young mom, as happens many times from that part of the world, separated from her husband, who, wrote the wrong thing on Facebook one day and was deported. And I never thought this family would be getting together. But that's the kind of social action that we wanted to do, supporting immigrants, supporting Black lives.
I want to display, Jeff, this monument that you have.
Yes, our old name there, but there you go. Yeah,
in front of your location on 12 Mile.
That was a couple summers ago. Yep.
Can you talk to us about this?
This was something that it was actually developed at a church as as an art exhibit, protest art. And then we reached out to them and asked, could we put it up? And we did this. A lot of people in our congregation just showed up to build it. These are little stuffed animals there. This is during the height of the child separation. So I want to say 3 summers ago, 2018, 2019, when the Trump administration was behaving in a particularly noxious way, which is saying a lot. And for us, this was one of many both protest kind of displays, but also participation in marches and refugee nights, freedom nights. We're hoping to do more work in justice with communities of color going forward, and to support the movement for Black lives and so forth. And on top of that, we also happen to be a place, and I would say almost singularly in the community, maybe one other, a congregation that openly debates some of the most taboo things. God is not the taboo issue in the Jewish world today. Israel is the taboo. That's the line you don't cross. And we have people that are questioning Israel. And questioning Israel's behavior, questioning all kinds of things about it. And I'm not going to say where I stand right now because it's immaterial. I stand for free discourse about it. And we are one of the few and the only one with a building that encourages that. So if that's the heretical service of today, we're continuing in that tradition.
Yes, and I've attended myself a debate you hosted once for the 2-state versus 1-state solution, and it was very interesting, and I was very thankful for such a debate to happen. Jeff, unfortunately, we are reaching to the end of our program, and I'm going to leave some questions that are actually very heavy questions, so I'm going to leave them. I'm glad that we have a space for another interview, hopefully in the future. But for now, I want to ask you a couple of things that I want to make sure to be included in this episode. Well, one is, so basically, practically, what do you do? There is this cycle of life rituals that you have adopted from traditional Judaism, and you have humanized. And that's something that is very interesting. These rituals that we're connected with. Do you feel that these is it because these rituals have been produced by the Jewish people, by the Jewish culture? Then they are very strongly they're not something to be given up because they are a product of the same society. Is it because of that, or is it because just of it's a habit, it's nostalgia that we want to keep these rituals that are usually a cause of happiness?
Well, I think first of all, let me say the kind of rituals that we have are similar in many, many, many cultures. Now I'm gonna get in trouble because I forgot the name of her book. But Sasha Sagan, Carl Sagan's daughter, I conducted an interview with her. She was supposed to visit us before COVID. And you'll find the name of the book maybe and refer.
Right, I have it actually.
For something like that. She writes about the commonalities across all structures and all religions and societies of welcoming rituals for children, of coming of age ceremonies, of matchmaking of one kind, marriage, weddings, whatever, of the ways that we part with people. So there's really nothing that unique in Judaism about the fact that we have these stages of life recognitions. But we do believe, as humanistic Jews, we believe very strongly in the power of ritual. We've abandoned the power of God because we realized that was always just people power anyway. So to be able to continue these rituals and to acknowledge openly that this is people power. We believe in that. Now, I can't speak for all my colleagues. Some of the humanistic rabbis feel differently about this topic. I do not participate in circumcision. I have all kinds of issues with that particular ritual. So that's been excised from any of my ceremonies. I have, I'm sure, plenty of people I've done naming ceremonies for whose children are circumcised. I don't ask, they don't tell, because they usually do it in the hospital. It's not part of the ritual. I'll tell you this, it's a very strong issue for me. My grandson, who is Orthodox, my oldest daughter is a very modern Orthodox Jew, but he had a ritual circumcision, a bris, and I was in the kitchen, my husband and I, with the women, listening to it. I respectfully turned down the honor that they wanted to give me in association with the ceremony. I was not interested in that. That is not how I want to bring a child into the world. And I was brought into the world that way too. So no, I don't think these are nostalgia. I think that they are the wonderful outpourings of joy of human life, something that we have to reconnect to in this this pandemic here. So many things we missed, so many losses we had with that. My granddaughter's birth and her naming ceremony, which is admittedly more modest, I wasn't able to be at that.
This is the book that you were referring
there we
to,
go.
Small Creatures Such as We by Sasha Sagan. She's the daughter of Carl Sagan.
Yes. Lovely, incredible book. Everybody should read it. I don't care what your beliefs are.
About the importance of rituals. So humanizing rituals, using some of the same Jewish prayers, but switching some of the wordings into
switch the words, new readings, etc. Which, by the way, all the liberal movements do. We borrow from each other. You tweak a word here and there, and you have the same sentiments.
Right, and right now, the Muslim community is still treading carefully into the area of reform. So you'll find it very sometimes ironic that, for example, an atheist Muslim who has, for example, died, and then the same Islamic rituals are made for him. One of the funny signs that I've seen is the Communist Party in Lebanon inviting its members to attend the funeral of one of its members who died, who's within an Islamic ceremony. So they have still attached themselves to the traditional rituals of religion as a culture without any changes to it. They are taking it as ceremonial, as rituals.
Listen, I know some Jews like that. I know Jews who don't really believe in God that belong to Orthodox synagogues. For them, it's the tight binding nature of the community that keeps them in.
Mm-hmm. And I feel that the Muslim community will produce an humanistic Islamic parallel rituals to the cycle of life sooner or later. I think we're going to get to that point, similar to what Humanistic Judaism has done. Final question, Jeff, is about Jews recognizing or identifying as people. Now, that's something that is it's a subject that is now Islam is also grappling with. You'll see a lot of new candidates, for example, identifying themselves as Muslim American, and they are not really sure about this identification. For example, Rashida Tlaib, who has been her constituency are mostly non-Muslims, and she's more of a secular. She has more of a secular agenda, but she was identified as a Muslim American, the first Muslim American woman in Congress, and she has embraced that identity. So I feel that some people, they say it's not good to identify yourself as a Muslim American because Islam is such a diverse religion, and there's no such thing as Muslim American. Also because you leave yourself as a target for some of the groups that want to target Muslim Americans. Some they say, no, it is actually a positive identity. So we're struggling with this subject at this point. Now, Judaism is different from Islam, and the way it doesn't propagate itself like Islam does. My understanding is that Jews have identified themselves as people recently, like within the beginning of the 18th century, 19th century.
It's more modern, but the concepts of identity have changed. So to say that we didn't call ourselves a people earlier on, we did in a sense. It was the word Am has been associated with us for a very, very long time. A people, a nation. The fact is that Jews come out of the matrix of Israelite and Judean ancient societies and have been evolving for a very, very long time, 2,800 years of this evolution of one group after another, assuming the mantle of their previous group and calling themselves something different. At some point, it really became around the religion. I would say some 2,000 years ago, that strong trend started. And once that was the case, the religion, the covenant with God, the brit that was made between the people and God, that became the defining mark. And, it wasn't so much the God part as the brit part, the covenant, because the covenant also included everyone. And it included everyone mythically who had ever lived and who was ever going to live. So that concept of peoplehood, but is relatively new in the way that we do it today, but it's also it also has deep roots, just like nationality has deeper roots in things that came before it, and onward going backwards. The fact is that there's no real good definition of what a Jew is, because if you say religion and you really want to be theologically consistent, I don't know what Reform Judaism has in common with Orthodox Judaism theologically. They are as different as Protestant, the most liberal Protestant group from the most fundamentalist Christian Southern Baptists. So if you want to say those are the same religion, fine. I guess they're both Christianity, but they certainly have very, very different beliefs about the deity and about everything else for that matter. So I think what the Jews have ultimately settled on is this idea of peoplehood. I struggle with it. I tend to think of us more as an extended family. And that's probably the best way to put it. You also have to remember we are very, very tiny. And that contributes a great deal to the ways that we think about ourselves. How many Muslims are there? Well over 1 billion, right?
Right.
And well more than 1 billion Christians. There are roughly 14.5, 15, maybe 16, if it depends on who's counting, million Jews in the world. Million Jews. That's not the metropolitan area of greater New York. That's less than that. All the Jews, we could all go settle in New York and take the place of the 16 million people there. And we might be a majority, but we're still going to have millions and millions of other people there who aren't us. Mm-hmm. And this has a big effect on us. The history of persecution has a big effect on us. And we, while we struggle, we also have this sort of sense of being intertwined with each other. Because of the historical experience, because of our smallness. You can't compare a tiny little group of people to these billions and billions of other people. It's going to have an effect on your identity, and it does.
Thank you, Rabbi Jeff, for this beautiful answer and for this interview. For everyone who's following us, this will be available also on the Muslimish Freethinkers podcast, and it will also be available immediately after its end on Facebook and Muslimish. All the best of luck for the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit and for Humanistic Judaism as a movement.
Thank you.
We definitely need all the humanism movements that exist today and more.
Well, thank you for the friendship, your first personal friendship and the friendship of Muslimish.
Thank you again and have a great night.
You too. Good night.
Thank you for listening to Muslimish Freethinkers. Do let us know what you think of this episode at facebook.com/Muslimish Muslimish. Don't forget to visit us at muslimish.org.